Hello, I'm Mike Scott in Oxford in the UK, and welcome from me and from Mike Collins, actually, who'll join us a bit later from Washington, DC. Welcome to this, which is our second event in the 2025 Zoom season of Cultural Encounters Books That Have Made a Difference, where we are bringing together scholars and their audiences in order to explore themes of encounter in literary works and contemporary cultural debates. Today, Dr. Philip Lavender will be discussing Unexpected Cultural Encounters in Iceland, the Saga of Hamlet. Philip gained his master's degree, and he's made bachelor's before that, but his master's degree from Oxford and his doctorate from the University of Copenhagen. He researches in the field of Old Norse and early modern Icelandic literature, and he does this work mainly with the University of Gothenburg. He is the author of Long Lives of Short Sagas in 2020 and co-editor with Matilda Amundsen Bergstrom of Faking It, The Performance of Forgery in Late Medieval and Early Modern Culture, which sounds like a fantastic book. I must read that. Um, I've had the pleasure today, actually, this morning, of reading the typescript of this talk, which is absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy it very much. If you have any questions during this talk, please type them in to us using the Q&A button, not the chat button on your computer. Towards the end, I will put as many of the questions as possible for our guests to answer and to discuss with both me and Mike Collins. Please don't leave your questions to the last minute, as we may run out of time. So with that, let's get on with it. Over to you, Philip. I'm looking forward to this. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Mike. I'm going to share my PowerPoint. I'll put it up here. Okay. I hope everybody can see that. So, thank you. It's really great to be able to speak here today. It's kind of wet and rainy and late Monday afternoon in Gothenburg, but I'm hoping that there's lots of fresh-faced, wide-awake people on the other side of the Atlantic who are ready to hear something strange about 17th century Iceland. As Mike mentioned, my specialism is medieval and early modern Icelandic literature, and today I'm going to be talking specifically about an early modern Icelandic saga, and I'm going on the assumption that not many people in the audience know a lot about Iceland or early modern Icelandic literature, so I'm going to be presenting for those who are not in the know. So apologies if there's any experts out there who've heard some of the background which I'm going to be talking about. Um, but what I'm going to do today is I'm going to start by talking a little bit about cultural encounters in general. Then I'll be talking about the historical and literary context of Iceland in the 17th century, for those who don't know that much about this topic. Then I'll be moving on and I'll be talking about Shakespeare's Hamlet and the forerunner to Shakespeare's Hamlet, which is a Danish text called Gesta Danorum by an author named Saxo Grammaticus, or translated into English, Gesta Danorum is The Deeds of the Danes. And following that, I'll be talking about this Icelandic saga from the 17th century, which is the Icelandic name is Ambalis Saga, but I translate it loosely as the Saga of Hamlet because Ambalis is the Icelandic name for the Hamlet character. And then after talking about the cultural encounters in this saga, I'll speak a little bit about books that have made a difference, which is of course the subtitle of this series of talks. And in what sense Ambalis Saga, the Saga of Hamlet, can be considered to be a book that has made a difference. Okay, so to start with, just a brief introduction about cultural encounters. I guess I could say a lot and delve into theoretical abysses talking about what is culture, what is a cultural encounter. But I wanted to just say very briefly to begin with that culture and cultural, these words have an inbuilt ambiguity because often when we talk about culture, we may be talking about specific cultural objects or experiences. You can see this very, very basic Venn diagram on the slide. Culture can be art, it can be reading a novel, looking at a painting, listening to some music, all different types of aesthetic experiences where we engage with some kind of object or performance. But often, when we talk about culture, we're also talking about people. We're talking about maybe when you talk about a multicultural society, it's different groups of people living together, and of course, part of that is them sharing their art, their literature, but it's also things like their other types of traditions, their food, and culture in these two different senses. Of course, as I said, there's a big overlap. But they're also somewhat different. So, I mean, a cultural experience where you read a book is one type of cultural experience, but a cultural experience where you travel to another country and meet other people who maybe you haven't met before and are different in some ways and similar in others is not quite the same. And one of the big differences is, of course, that when you read a book, the book can't necessarily speak back at you. It's not a dialogue in the same sense that when you travel or meet other cultural groups of people, there can be a dialogue. You can learn from these people and they can learn from you, and you can have this kind of back and forth. But what I'm talking about today, this saga, is obviously a type of cultural experience in the bubble on the right, the books, reading a story. But within this cultural experience, there is representations of different types of people from different cultures. It's a saga which tells the story of somebody who travels, meets people who are different than himself, and so it also represents contact with other peoples and culture in the other sense. And one of the things I would like you to think about when I'm talking about the saga of Hamlet, or Ambali's saga, is in what sense cultural encounters that we have with books and texts and literary text also involve a chance for us to understand and better know other cultures. It can, of course, there are positive aspects of this. We can learn more about different people through reading. We can maybe become more empathetic, get to know like different parts of the world. But there's also negative sides, because when we read a book about different peoples, there may be stereotypes. There could be negative representations which aren't true to reality and which lead to misinformed opinions of these other cultures. So this is what I'll be thinking about in terms of cultural encounters and the saga of Hamlet. But first, a little bit of historical context. As I said, I don't know how many people, how many of you listening know much about Iceland's history, but I think it's quite important to talk a little bit about it before we talk about the saga. And I'm going right back to the beginning, and the beginning of Icelandic history is round about 870, or at least that's what the traditional accounts of Icelandic history say. Because Iceland, this island in the North Atlantic, which you can see on the picture on the bottom right of the slide, Iceland was uninhabited up until relatively late, and it was only around about 870 when it started being settled to any significant degree. There's some ideas that maybe prior to 870, some Irish monks, had set out to sea, floating on little coracles, looking for solitude in the North Atlantic, and ended up on in Iceland, and lived in caves, praying and contemplating their religious life. But there's not a great deal of evidence about this, so there's debate about to what extent this would have happened. If it did happen, there were only a few Irish monks who ended up in Iceland. And the main wave of settlement came after 870, when settlers from mainland Scandinavia and the British Isles, Nordic peoples who settled in the British Isles, ended up moving to Iceland. And there's many different theories about what the cause of this migration was. In Icelandic medieval texts, there's much discussion about how in Norway at the time, Harald Fairhair was a king who was trying to centralize political power in Norway, and thus kind of chased out a lot of the petty chieftains and their families and followers, and they fled and moved to Iceland to set up their own society and their own community without this kind of centralized power. from 870 to around 930, there was this wave of settlement, and we think maybe around 60,000 people settled Iceland. And the map, which you can see, has a lot of little kind of dots on it. And these are all the dots from places which we think were settled within these first 60 years of the settlement. So basically, the whole coastal area of Iceland was settled very heavily within just a period of 60 years. And Iceland was then a very special place. It was very different to all the other European countries at the time, and this was because it was one of the few countries that didn't have any centralized monarchy. There was no king, there was no queen, there were no royal families or nobles in Iceland. And this was something which was very unique within medieval Europe, where most countries had monarchies. And this meant also that the people who had settled in Iceland needed to find some way of building a society together which differed from all the other types of societies which they were familiar with. And they did this to a certain extent by establishing a parliament, an Althing, which had perhaps not completely democratic representation, but was much more proto-democratic and much more democratic than the other forms of government which existed at the time. And this annual parliament would meet and would deal with legislative functions, setting laws, and also judicial functions, so having courts and trying people who broke the laws. There was no executive function, so if you wanted to punish somebody who'd broken a law and who'd been judged to have committed a crime, then you had to take that into your own hands. And this meant that there were often feuds or violence between the larger families within Iceland at the time. And this violence, which arose because of this system, because of the lack of any executive function, there were no police, this meant that this created the subject for a lot of the Icelandic sagas which were later written. People looking to punish outlaws who'd committed crimes or committed a murder, and these feuds between the families is one of the main focuses of the Icelandic sagas, or the sagas of Icelanders, which is a sub-branch of sagas, because in general saga just means any prose text written in the medieval or an early modern period in Iceland. So after this settlement period and the establishment of the parliament, eventually around about the year 1000, Iceland converted to Christianity, and after the conversion to Christianity, literacy arrived in Iceland, and by the 13th century had arrived what we call the golden age of saga writing. So literacy arrived and people started writing down these stories, and many of them were focused on the past and on the settlement period and the feuds which I have just discussed, which arose in this historical context. Also in the 13th century, things started getting more complicated as power was being centralized, it was being concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. And so the most powerful families in Iceland fought with each other and eventually sought aid from the Norwegian king. And eventually this led to the submission to the Norwegian crown in 1262. And so this was basically the end of this proto-democratic exercise in nationhood, which had no precedent in the Europe of the time. And Iceland then was submitted to monarchical power for at least the many hundreds of years, until it was only after the Second World War that Iceland gained full independence again. So first they were submitted to the Norwegian crown, but then around 1397 the Kalmar Union was formed, in which Norway became came under the Danish crown, and so Iceland as well was then was subjected to the Danish monarchy. Around 1550 there was Reformation in Iceland, so this was a change in religion. Catholicism was left behind, Lutheranism became the main religion, but much still remained the same. And by the 17th century, which is the time when the saga, which I'm going to be talking about today, was written, Iceland was a Lutheran country under Danish power, and this power was ever greater, because in 1602 the Danish imposed a trade monopoly, This meant that all trade to Iceland had to go through Danish merchants, and previously Icelanders had traded with English sailors, with Scottish sailors, with Basque sailors. Now they had to, all trade had to go through Denmark. And in 1662, the Icelanders were also forced to swear an oath to the Danish monarch, as monarchical absolutism was brought in. So control was getting tighter for the Icelanders during this period. So it was a difficult time in the 17th century. And another thing which was tricky at this time, and you can see on the list of historical context, that the Turkish abductions was something which took place in Iceland in 1637. And this was when basically a group of pirates from North Africa, or from what is modern day Algeria and Morocco, raided along the coast of Iceland and abducted around 400 people, and took them back to North Africa to be sold into the slave trade there. And this was a kind of major cultural trauma of the time. Why was it called the Turkish abductions if these pirates came from North Africa? At the time, North Africa was mostly vassal states to the Ottoman Empire, and in Icelandic, the Ottomans and all of the people who were subject to them were called Tyrkir, or Turks, in a very loose translation. And so people talked about the Tyrkiran, or the Turkish abductions. And so there was this cultural trauma which resulted in a kind of enmity towards the Ottomans, towards North African peoples, and Muslims as well, because of the religion was associated with these groups of people. And that's something which we'll see in the saga, which I'll be talking about. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the Hamlet sagas. What is the connection with Hamlet with this saga which I'm talking about today? And there are many different types of stories about Hamlet, but one which I hope most of you are familiar with is Shakespeare's play. In Shakespeare's play, the scene is Elsinore in Denmark, not too far from where I am today, maybe 3 or 4 hours down the coast. And there's a young prince who becomes aware that his father's untimely death is due to foul play. His uncle, it seems, has killed his father and usurped the throne, and also married Hamlet's mother. And this discovery leads Hamlet to take on what's described as an antic disposition. He acts as if he's a fool. He acts as if he's lost his marble, so to speak, because he thinks that if he does this, perhaps then he will distract any suspicions which might fall upon him and lead him to fall foul of the same kind of treachery that led to his father's death. But this ploy fails. His uncle becomes suspicious and decides to send him away to face death abroad. He doesn't want to be responsible for killing his own nephew there, in case the people of the nation should turn against him because they love the Prince Hamlet. But Hamlet, when he's sent away, manages to avoid this grisly fate, and he finally returns to enact vengeance. It's a tragic ending, however, because although Hamlet enacts his vengeance, he also dies in the process. So I'm imagining that most of you have a rough idea of this story already. And while Shakespeare's material was treated in a groundbreaking way, he took the outlines of it from previously existing texts. It wasn't a completely new invention of Shakespeare. And there's a lot of debate about specifically, the stages of this genealogy which led to Shakespeare's Hamlet. But most people believe there was an Ur-Hamlet, which was maybe by Thomas Kyd and was from around just over 10 years before Shakespeare's Hamlet, maybe 1587. If there was this play, it seems that Shakespeare and Thomas Kyd were relying on a previous text. This was François de Belleforet's Histoire tragique from 1570, written in French, and a text containing many tragical stories, one of them of which was the story of Hamlet. It was translated into English. But Francois de Belforêt took his story of Hamlet probably from an edition of the Gesta Danorum, which was published in Paris in 1514. The text is a Latin text. It was written in Latin originally. And although this was the first printed text of the Gesta Danorum from 1514, it's based originally on a text which was written by Saxo Grammaticus around the year 1200. So the story goes all the way back to the Middle Ages. And Gesta Danorum, The Deeds of the Danes, is a long work consisting of 16 books, and it tells a history of all the kings of Denmark from the legendary past up until much more recently. And the story of Hamlet is told in books 3 and 4. So it's just a small part of Saxo's work. And Saxo's version is similar in a number of ways. It tells of Amletus. Amletus is the name of Hamlet in Saxo's version. He's the son of Ervendil, and Ervendil is murdered by his brother Fengi, just as Hamlet's father is murdered by Claudius, his own brother. And Amletus in Saxo's version also pretends to be a fool in order to avoid suspicion, but many people have suspicions and think maybe he's smarter than he appears. And eventually Fengi, his evil uncle, gets suspicious and decides to send him away to Britain in order to be killed. And in Saxo's story, the whole version, the whole narrative of Amletus's trip to England is narrated. In Shakespeare, it's basically just told. It happens behind the scenes, and we get like a little bit of we get told a little bit by Hamlet when he comes back, but it's not narrated explicitly in Shakespeare's version. In Saxo's version, it is. He goes to Britain, he makes friends with the British king, he gets married to his daughter, and eventually he comes back and enacts his vengeance. And so Saxo's version of Hamlet has more information at the start. It's got more information at the middle. It's a kind of more detailed and extended version of Shakespeare's Hamlet. And Shakespeare had obviously edited the story a lot. But the story which we'll be talking about today, the Saga of Hamlet, Ambalis Saga, is also contains all this extra material, so it's a lot more detailed than Hamlet Shakespeare. And Ambalis Saga, the Saga of Hamlet, was written in Iceland in the 17th century, but it's from a parallel branch. So if Amletus in Saxo Grammaticus kind of went to Shakespeare via these stages which I mentioned, there was this completely other branch which led to this Icelandic saga, and the author of which is anonymous, but we know that Ambalis Saga, the author had no idea about Shakespeare's work, he hadn't read it, he wasn't familiar with it. So these, as I said, are two independent branches of the story. And Ambalis Saga has a lot of the names of the people are different, so I'm trying to help you out here by putting some of the names on the slide so it doesn't get too confusing. But basically, Ambalis is Hamlet here, and Ambalis is the son of Salmon, who is the son of Donrek, and Salmon is the king of Cimbria. Instead of being in Denmark, he's in a place called Cimbria. And his enemy here is not his brother, Balant or Hauker. His brothers are his friends, but is a man called Faustinus, who is the son of Soldan. And Faustinus is from a place called Scythia. And Faustinus travels to Cimbria and murders Salmon, and then tries to marry Ambalis' mother. But it doesn't really go that well because there is a curse which prevents him from being able to satisfy his lust with Ambalis' mother. So it's a bit of a different dynamic in this saga. Instead of having two brothers, the one who has murdered the other, and an internal family feud, this is now a feud between two different groups of people, the Scythians and the Cimbrians, and Ambalis is in the middle of this. but much of the story is the same because Ambalis, just as in Hamlet and in Saxo Grammaticus's version, pretends to be foolish, wanders around rolling in the mud and doing lots of things to draw suspicion away from himself, because he knows if he's suspected of being too smart, then Faustinus will murder him, just like he murdered his father, Salmon. And what I want to talk here about is why have these changes been made to the story? Why do we have Scythians and Cimbrians? Where did that all come from? How does this contribute to the story? And for those of you who are not familiar with the Scythians and Cimbrians, well, these are ancient peoples who are described in a number of classical texts. So the Scythians, for example, are described in Herodotus's histories. They are said there in Herodotus's histories. We're told about the nomadic tribes of Scythians who lived in Asia and were forced into Cimmeria, or Cimbria. What is now Scythia is said to have been long ago inhabited by Cimmerians. The Cimmerians were expelled by the Scythians, who forced them from their homes along the shores of the Black Sea. So Herodotus, his text, his histories, was first published in 1502. Before that, the medieval period had not had access to the stories of Herodotus, so this was fairly new. In the 17th century, it had been around for just over 100 years after this big lacuna between the classical period and the early modern period. So when Saxo was writing, he would have never have heard of the Scythians or the Cimbrians. He wasn't familiar with this work. But by the time that Saxo was writing, early modern writers had access to Herodotus's histories and knew this story of the Scythians and the Cimbrians. So the author of the Ambalis saga has taken this historical enmity between these two peoples and inserted it into his story of Hamlet. The Cimbrians themselves were, it seems, a group of people who lived, believe it or not, as you can see on this map, in Denmark. Actually in Jutland, which is kind of the peninsula part of Denmark. It's not on the island of Zealand, which is where Elsinore is nowadays. But people had become aware that in ancient history, the Cimbrians were a group living in Denmark who round about 100 BC had gone on a migration. Apparently they were forced out of their country for some unknown reason. They ended up doing a very windy route around much of Europe and ended up on the borders of the Roman Empire, and a battle at Vercellae, where they were defeated by Gaius Marius, who was a Roman consul, and that's the last we really know of the Cimbrians. But it seems that the Cimbrians, according to Herodotus, had been forced out of their land by the Scythians and then ended up in Denmark and then were forced out again and ended up being wiped out when they came into contact with the Roman Empire. And one may wonder, so why was this story about these two ancient groups of people integrated into the story of Hamlet by the author of Ambalis saga? And the answer probably lies in the fact that in the early modern period, both Denmark and Sweden had become very interested in the Scythians and the Cimbrians. So there was an etymological connection between Scythia and Scythia, which is kind of the medieval name for Sweden, which meant that the Swedes believed that they were actually one and the same as the Scythians. In the 16th and 17th century, Denmark and Sweden were mortal enemies. There had been numerous battles between these two countries, and these battles also were linked to a kind of a cultural warfare, where both countries wrote histories and texts slandering the other and trying to prove that they were culturally superior. And so one of the important texts was by a guy called Johannes Magnus, who wrote a work. He was also in exile. He was a Catholic and was forced out of Lutheran Sweden, but he wrote a long work, the history of the Swedes, and in it he talks about how the Scythians are the Swedes, and how they historically had an enmity with the Danish people who were barbaric. In order to come back and defend themselves against Johannes Magnus's slanders, Danish historiographers discussed their relationship with the Cimbri or the Cimbrians. So this is a quote taken from Karen Skogård Petersen, who is one of the people who studied this topic most. And she says, the Cimbri come into the picture in Danish historiography. They had fled from the cruel Scythians, as we read about in Herodotus, and the Scythians are, according to Johannes Magnus, related to the Goths and thus also the Swedes. And so the Cimbri settled in what would later be known as the Danish Isles, and together with another group of people, the Danes, the peace-loving Cimbri elected their first king Dan. Then, under pressure from the Goths, the Danes are forced to emigrate to Italy, and thus we hear of the Cimbri's battle against Marius around the year 100 BC. So what is happening here is the Danes and the Swedes are writing contrasting versions of ancient history, both defending their right to greatness in antiquity. The Danes eventually came to see themselves as direct descendants of the Cimbri. The Swedes saw themselves as direct descendants of the Scythians. And so when in Ambalis saga, the original plot is set off by a conflict between the Cimbrians and the Scythians, we can see this Icelandic author from the 17th century has taken these Swedish and Danish accounts and integrated them into an older story from Saxa Grammaticus in order to represent contemporary concerns. And these contemporary concerns are the conflicts between Sweden and Denmark in the 17th century. So when we're presented with this cultural encounter, the cultural clash between the Scythians and the Cimbrians, what we're symbolically being presented with is the war between the Swedes and the Danes. The precarity of life at court for Ambalis is compounded by the geopolitical clashes of these two groups. And while the events are ancient, this is a thoroughly modern, as I said, 16th going on 17th century interpretation of Scandinavian history. And for the Icelanders, who were subjects of the Danish monarch, identification with the Cimbri as Danes is complex because the Icelanders are sworn to the Danish crown, so they should really be taking the side of the Cimbrians. But at the same time, they're feeling pressure from the Danish crown. They're feeling pressure from the Danish trade monopoly, from the imposition of absolute monarchy. And so they have this kind of strange colonial relationship with Denmark. And as I mentioned before, the Icelanders were a people who were forced out of Norway, it seems, according to their own versions. Forced out of Norway, immigrated or fled to Iceland and created a nation there, much as the Cimbri had done. So they are both similar to the Cimbrians, but also different to the Cimbrians, because if the Cimbrians are the Danes, these are their current colonial powers. I hope you're all following this. It's, as I said, it's kind of a complicated situation. But what I'm going to talk about is another part of the saga now, the saga of Ambalis, where there's also kind of special development in this 17th century saga, which is very different to what we find in Saxa Grammaticus, and also different to what we have in the story of Hamlet as presented by Shakespeare. And this is when, in Shakespeare, Claudius sends Hamlet away and he says, prepare thyself, the bark is ready and the wind at help, the associates tend and everything is bent for England. And then he turns aside and kind of in typical kind of Shakespearean villain fashion says, letters congruing to that effect, the present death of Hamlet are being sent with him. So he's sending this letter, which is basically a death warrant for Hamlet. And as I mentioned, in Shakespeare's play, this trip to Britain, to England, is mentioned, and then Hamlet disappears off scene, and then shortly afterwards we hear that Claudius has received a letter that Hamlet is coming back. So the story is not told in detail, it's basically told in retrospect. And this same story is told in Saxa Grammaticus, and in Saxa Grammaticus it's slightly more detailed, because he tells of Hamlet traveling to Britain, meeting the British king, swapping the letters, saving himself from the death warrant, and then becoming friends with the British king and marrying the British king's daughter before returning to enact his vengeance. In the 17th century Icelandic saga, this is changed. The story is different. In this saga, Ambalis does not travel to Britain or England in order to, because the evil king wants to have him murdered there. Instead, he travels to Scythia, and this is because Faustinus, the evil king who has murdered his father, has a brother called Tamalaus who lives in Scythia. They're all from Scythia originally, but Tamalaus is now king there. And so Ambalis travels to Scythia and meets Tamalaus. And Tamalaus is the Icelandic name, or kind of a translation of Tambalan, who some people may know from another famous early modern play, which is Christopher Marlowe's Tambalan the Great. And Tambalan, the Icelandic author had not read Christopher Marlowe's play in the same way that the Icelandic author had not read Shakespeare's Hamlet. But Tambalan, Marlowe's Tambalan, is also based on a historical figure. This historical figure is Timur. Timur was a Turco-Mongol conqueror who was born in the 14th century in what is modern-day Uzbekistan, and was a distant relative of Genghis Khan. And Timur embarked upon a series of conquests in the 14th century, much like Genghis Khan did, and conquered vast swathes of territory in Central Asia, in the Caucasus, and Asia Minor as well. And he ended up, by the start of the 15th century, in 1402, near Ankara, having a fight. And this Timur is, as I said, is the same as Tamalaus here. And so it seems that the author of Ambalis saga has thought, the British Isles are maybe a little bit boring, that's quite familiar to us. What if we send Ambalis over to Asia Minor to be with Timur, this great Turco-Mongol conqueror? But as I said, modern historiography discusses Timur as a Turco-Mongol conqueror, but early modern historiography saw him as a Scythian. They used the classical name of the Scythians to describe him, and you can see some images on the slide here of kind of representations from early modern books of what Tamerlan or Tambalan or Tamalaus looked like. You can see he's wearing a turban. He's got a number of traits which are associated with a kind of oriental symbolism and iconography for early modern in early modern images. And because he was deemed to be a Scythian, the author was able to connect Timur from the 14th century with these ancient Scythians who were mentioned in Herodotus. Remember, Herodotus was writing around the 5th century BC. So there's a long period between the actual Scythians described by Herodotus and Scythian Tamerlan in the 14th century. But the Icelandic author has made this connection. And what's even more interesting is that when Ambalis ends up with Timur, Tamalaus in Asia Minor, he gets embroiled. He becomes friends with Tamalaus. He swaps the letter, which is ordering his death, saves himself, marries Tamalaus' daughter, and then joins Tamalaus in a battle for Constantinople. And this is something which has no precedence in Saxo Grammaticus or anything else. But it turns out that at the time when he's there, that Constantinople has been besieged by a group of Saracens or Ottomans under the rule of a man called Bastian. Constantinople's Christian king, Chrysolitus, is at great risk. He doesn't know how to defend himself, and Tamalaus decides to go and help the Christian king, even though he himself is not a Christian, to go and fight on his behalf. So Ambalis and Tamalaus end up at Constantinople fighting the Ottomans, defeating them, and saving the Christian nation of Constantinople. And we think this story seems also to be based on loosely based on a historical fact, which is the Battle of Ankara in 1402. Ankara, not Constantinople, which wasn't a battle between Christians and Muslims, between Christians and Saracens or Ottomans, but was rather between Tamalaus and the Ottomans. So it wasn't a religious battle in that sense, but it seems the author has adapted it to be a battle between Christians and Muslims, because of this time, of course, I mentioned in Iceland, after the Turkish raids, there was a general antipathy towards the Ottomans in general, and so this seems to have been a way of representing some kind of cultural conflict between the forces of Christianity and Christendom and the forces of a different religion, a different group of people, a different culture. The Ottomans, Ottomans or Saracens, they're called both in the saga, are presented in not a very flattering light. This is probably an example of what I mentioned when I said that cultural encounters within literary text can be stereotypical. They can not necessarily be very empathetic. This shows a kind of a slightly dehumanizing representation of the Saracens, of the Ottomans. But at the same time, there are also characters which show that the author was maybe not always so black and white in his thoughts about these different cultures. So Tamalaus himself is said not to be Christian, but he's also not a Saracen. He's somewhere in between. He's fighting on the side of good, even though he hasn't taken the faith of the Christians. And there's also Jewish warriors who are mentioned in the army of the Ottomans. Sebastian has a general called Adrianus, who is said specifically to be Jewish, and who at the end of the battle is mentioned to be particularly honourable and decent, such that Ambalis at the end spares his life, and he swears fealty to Ambalis and then follows him around for the rest of the saga as one of his faithful companions. So there's this crazy cultural encounter with Ottomans, Turks, Saracens, pagans who are somewhere in between, Jewish warriors and Christian warriors all in one place, in a very kind of imaginative, loosely based on historical events version of history. So this is so I hope this gives you kind of a sense that Ambalis saga tells the story of Hamlet, the familiar story of Hamlet, but it also introduces a whole load of other kind of cultural encounters, and that the author in 17th century Iceland, which was a very kind of homogenous culture, there not many people who lived in Iceland had the possibility to travel abroad. Not many of them would have been able to experience other cultures firsthand. And much of their possibility of experiencing other cultures would have been through literary text, through sagas such as this one. That the author is using these details, these additional details, and these changes to the story of Hamlet to rethink the relationships in the ancient world, in ancient Scandinavia, connecting it to contemporary issues such as the conflicts between Sweden and Denmark, the conflicts with the Ottomans, as the Ottomans were a growing power in the 17th century who were feared by many people within Christendom, and using this also as kind of an exciting, exotic, different aspect which could be brought into this thoroughly Scandinavian story of Hamlet, the Danish king. And I think I was going to say a few words about books that have made a difference, and why a story as obscure as the saga of Hamlet or saga of Ambalis could be considered to be a book that has made a difference. But I think I may have overrun my time a little bit, so maybe I should draw it to a close here. But if anybody wants to ask me a question on it in the Q&A, then they're very welcome to. And I think I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Well, Philip, thanks very much for that. And it's quite incredible, really. But what you're talking about, this whole history that's been going on that, frankly, I didn't know anything about. I knew a bit about the sources of Hamlet, of course, but I didn't know the context, the complex context of this. Tell me, if you're in Denmark or Sweden, if you grow up in Denmark, Sweden, do you know this history? Because it's quite recent. I mean, we know the history of what was happening with the Spanish Armada and so on. Is it taught um, in Sweden and Denmark?
Well, Saxa Grammaticus is kind of the foundational text of Danish literature. I mean, it's a Latin text, so it's not as accessible as many other texts. But most Danish school children will be presented at some point with who is Saxa Grammaticus and what is this book, The Deeds of the Danes. They probably won't read it from start to finish because it's a very long text. But they'll probably know some of the stories from it because it gathers stories of legendary kings over a period of thousands of years, and some of them are very well-known stories and fun stories. And if you live in Copenhagen, Elsinore is or Helsinger is just a couple of hours by train drive north, and you can visit the castle which Shakespeare sets his play of Hamlet in. And so most people in Denmark will have probably been there at some point or visited and heard this story.
Do they know about the Cimbrians and the Scythians and that this is their forefathers? They,
No, no, they don't. And this is slightly different because the Cimbrians, and the Scythians, this is very big in early modern historiography. It becomes very important, but nowadays it's not accepted historiography as such. So, for example, the Scythians, the connection between the Scythians and the Swedes, it was based on a kind of folk etymology. People thought Scythia sounds like Scythia, so they must be the same people. This doesn't pass contemporary scientific standards as an argument for kind of your history. So nowadays, nobody really believes that the Scythians and the Swedes are one and the same people, or that there was a connection between them. The Cimbri really were a people who lived in a part of Denmark, but it's kind of an obscure part of Danish history, also because there's very, very few sources which discuss the Cimbri. Um, I mean, one of the main sources about them would have been Livy's History of Rome. He would have. We know that in some of the books of Livy, he discussed the Cimbrian wars in detail, but those books are completely lost. So nowadays, if you want to read about it, you can look at Plutarch, his Parallel Lives. There's a chapter
Mm.
on Gaius Marius, and it
Mm.
describes this Roman general who was a great Roman general and his defeat of the Cimbrians. So that's one place where you could read about it. But this history is not very well known amongst Swedes and Danes nowadays.
Thanks for that. Tony Eade asks, can you say more about how ideas from other cultures reached Iceland? Was it Icelanders going abroad or others going to Iceland? And who were they? Were they intellectuals, priests, or traveling saga tellers, or other groups? Thanks, Tony.
Yeah. So yeah, there's several different ways, I guess, in which information would have been reached Iceland. One is that because Iceland was a colony, so to speak, of Denmark, um, me- people who wanted to train to be priests, for example, there was special scholarships for Icelanders at the University of Copenhagen. So a lucky, educated few would travel to Copenhagen, to the university there, and would come into contact with the wider world through the University of Copenhagen. There were no universities, there were no universities in Iceland, so you didn't have that possibility in Iceland. And often these people who studied in Copenhagen then would go back to Iceland and would write texts, they would write stories, they would become priests, and maybe share information about the wider world with other people who were living in Iceland. Danes would have traveled a lot to Iceland, especially when the trade once the trade monopoly was in place, all of the trade would be mostly with Danish merchants. Before that, there had been English merchants, there had been Basque merchants, and there would have been discussions. There would have been some kind of cultural exchange with these people, but this became much more limited in the 17th century. So, I mean, Iceland was an outpost, and not that many people from abroad would end up in Iceland, and not that many people from Iceland would end up abroad. The Turkish raids, there were, as I said, for about 400 people who ended up being abducted to northern Africa. Um, and the Danish king negotiated for the release of some of them. And so, about 10 years later, a group of these people who'd spent nearly a decade in northern Africa returned to Iceland. And they would have had, I guess, a number of interesting stories to tell about their experience. There's one of them actually writes a narrative, a story of his time in northern Africa and all the things he experienced. So that's
Yeah, if I remember correctly, those raids also took place in North Wales, and
yeah,
yeah,
and the Irish coast as well. Yeah, there was
yes, yeah, the
a
Irish
lot of
coast and North.
yeah, these corsairs raiding in the kind of North Atlantic and the British Isles. Yeah.
Yeah, I know Mike Collins wants to ask you about Tamburlaine and Hamlet, so I'll go. I'll ask.
No, he doesn't want to ask that question. But the question he wants to
Well,
ask
I will
is,
in a minute.
yeah, this is a 17th century work,
Mm.
and it's very much, I guess the word would be anachronistic. In Western Europe, that kind of storytelling uh, is virtually over, I would think, by 1500, say. I mean, I'm just trying, medieval romance, all that melange of stuff that goes on in, say, Malory and the King Arthur's Knights, that disappears. When Spencer writes The Faerie Queene, he's consciously going back and writing anachronistically. And I wonder why that is. Does it have something to do with the isolation of Iceland, or is there a reason why you would find in the 17th century, a form that is really, it's like the Volkswagen Beetle in 20. It's retro, as they say.
Yeah. I mean, so yeah, these you're right. These types of romantic sagas with knights and battles and magic and everything. It was very popular in Iceland in the 14th century, in the 15th century, and then it continues into the 16th and the 17th
Hmm.
century, and even the 18th century. And one reason is that, as I said, as Iceland was a an outpost, a colonial outpost of Denmark, there was only one printing press in Iceland, and this printing press was basically run by the church, and they would only publish books which were on religious themes. So in other parts of Europe, it was becoming much more. There was much more printed text circulating, and this brought with it new genres, new types of literature. In Iceland, most people didn't have access to popular literature in printed form, and that, to a certain extent, could have meant that people continued to tell the traditional types of sagas that they'd told previously. And Ambalis saga, for example, it was never a printed book. It was copied by hand from manuscript to manuscript. So when I was going to mention books that have made a difference, Ambalis saga never had the possibility to kind of spread and to gain mass appeal, because it was just copying a manuscript by hand takes a long time. It doesn't. It's not as efficient as printed books. So I think
When was it first printed?
the first printed edition was in 1897. It was by
Eight. Oh.
yeah, and it was a British scholar, Sir Israel Galangs, published it in 1897. And this was part of kind of a late Victorian interest in kind of Shakespeare and the kind of Scandinavian Viking roots of Shakespeare. Um, but it's never been published in Iceland as a printed book. And in Iceland, I mean, people continued hand copying sagas right up until the start of the 20th century. It was only when national radio came about and people started listening to the radio that hand copying manuscripts and these traditional stories really
Mm.
died out.
Yeah. So there was, it would be fair to say there was no Renaissance in Iceland.
There was, it's, it's, I wouldn't say that exactly, but Iceland remained very traditional in many senses, and many medieval genres continued to live on long after they were no longer produced in other parts of Europe. But there, but these I mentioned these Icelandic scholars who would go and study at the University of Copenhagen. Many of them would come back having been exposed to kind of the latest Renaissance history, theories. And they would come back, and some of them would write these amazing kind of very early modern, learned texts. They just didn't have much popular appeal. So there was a kind of low key Renaissance going on amongst a small group of elite scholars and churchmen in Iceland, while the rest of the people really didn't have so much access to it.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. Let's get to Tamburlaine and Hamlet. How does this happen in the early 1590s?
How does it happen? How does he end up there in this?
Well, I suppose if you think that the Hamlet's by Kyd, and of course Marlowe and Kyd lived together, so they perhaps discussed it. I don't know. I'm not too sure that the Hamlet was Kyd, but never mind. But anyway, what do you think?
I mean, in Iceland, I mean, I've tried to. I've published an article where I try and trace, where does how does Tamburlaine end up in an Icelandic text? So you can go and read that if you want, because it goes into much more detail. But Tamburlaine and Timur, he appeared in a number of chronicles which circulated throughout Europe. There were a number of Lutheran chronicles, Carrion's Chronicle, Melanchthon's History of the World, Sebastian Munster. A lot of early modern German chronicles tried to discuss the history of the world, and one of the important events which happened around the year 1400 involved Timur, Tamburlaine defeating the Ottoman emperor, and this became even more popular as the Ottomans became a bigger and bigger threat throughout the 16th and 17th century. A lot of early modern historiographers and scholars really enjoyed mentioning this historical event, and some of these chronicles were copied. They were Latin chronicles and there were German chronicles. Some of them were copied into Danish or Swedish, and then they came to be translated into Iceland. So you can see the name of Timur or Tamburlaine turning up in Icelandic chronicles from the 16th century onwards. And I think the author of the Saga of Ambalis, he basically had just kind of found like bits and pieces from different stories, different histories, and was really interested in these strange names and different kind of far off historical events, and wanted to integrate them into his narrative. So that's
very interesting. Absolutely terrific, really, So, well, if any of you who've joined us found it a little complex going through, Mike and I hope that we're going to be able to publish the talks in this series, and certainly this one would be one to go through and examine. I just reading it, I enjoyed it so much, and listening to you also, Phil, I've enjoyed it. One other thing that just struck me, I was talking to somebody who talked about the Inuit people up in North Canada, and they still sit around and tell stories in the way that I think you'd say that the Icelandic people did it. But there wouldn't have been any connection. I think that would have been far too far, wouldn't it? Anyway.
I don't know. I mean, I think sitting around and telling stories maybe it's just a kind of basic human
Absolutely.
activity. But of course, I mean, there were contacts between Iceland and the other parts of the North Atlantic, particularly in the medieval period. So we know that there were contacts between these peoples, but probably not. Maybe they were both telling their stories and sitting around telling their stories on either side of the kind of cultural divide.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for such an interesting and informative session. And as I've said to everyone, we hope eventually, but it depends on publishers, of course, but we hope eventually to be able to publish the book of this series, as we have done with Christian Shakespeare ? And the Christian Literary Imagination. So we keep our fingers crossed about that in due course. Our next Cultural Encounters will be on Monday the 3rd of March, when Claire Asquith will be discussing the book Death Comes to the Archbishop by Willa Cather. It's a hugely interesting book about the missionaries and how they lived in the south of what is now the USA, on the Mexican border, and how they moved around and what happened. Fascinating book of cultural encounter that's going on there between the New America and the Spanish and the Mexicans. A terrific book, and it's a short book. So anyway, I'm looking forward to that from Claire Asquith. And that's on Monday the 3rd of March. On Wednesday the 19th of March at 4 p.m. No, it's not. It's at 3 p.m. UK time. We have a free speech event when we'll be talking about energy for our future needs. That's on the 19th of March. Energy for our future needs. It's at 11 a.m. US time, and I'm not too sure about the change of clocks, when they've happened or not. So they might have happened. If they have happened, it'll be 3 p.m. UK time. That's Wednesday the 19th of March, and it's on energy for our future needs, looking at nuclear, of course, but also batteries and so on and so forth. Thanks.
Excuse me, Mike.
Yeah.
The clocks change on the 9th of March in the United States.
Okay, and not till the end of March with us. Therefore, it will be at 3 p.m.
3 p.m.
With us. Yes. Okay, that's on the 19th of March. Thanks to Georgetown University for supporting this series, especially Vice President Global Affairs Tom Banchoff. Thanks to our administrator at Georgetown, Mary Gordon. Thanks, Mike, for joining us. Thanks again, Philip. I'd also like to thank people at Blackfriars Hall, especially Dominic White, the prior, John O'Connor, the regent, and Richard Finn, the director of the Las Casas Institute. I'd like to thank Maggie, who helps with the administration at this end. I'm Mike Scott from Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on LinkedIn as Professor Michael Scott, or on Facebook as Michael Kerr Scott. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week. Again, thanks, Philip. Really enjoyed it. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.